Welcome to part one of the Wilmette Local Legends audio tour. I'm Sarah Hawkinson, Sunday coordinator at the Wilmette Historical Museum. I will be your guide on this audio tour. Our first stop, 725 Ridge Road, was once the childhood home of movie star Ann-Margret. In the 1950s, this building housed a funeral home called Alton Mortuary. For a couple of years, it was also the home of Ann-Margret, whose family name was Olson. Her mother worked here as a receptionist, while her father, an electrician, recovered from an on-the-job accident, and little Ann-Margret attended Logan, now Mackenzie, school. Later, when she started at Howard Junior High, the Olsons rented part of a house on Wilmette Avenue. But all her life, Ann-Margret has recalled the strangeness of living at the funeral home, where she had to wait until mourners had left before she could go to bed. By the time she was a senior at New Trier, she was already determined to be an entertainer. She went to Northwestern to study theater, and by the time she was 21 had left Wilmette to make a splash in Hollywood. Among her famous movies are Bye Bye Birdie, Carnal Knowledge, and Grumpy Old Men. We're going to say bye-bye to Ann-Margret now and move on to our next stop, 230 17th Street, once the home of Chester Gould. Please pause your audio, and I will meet you outside Gould's home. Our second stop, 230 17th Street, was once the home of Chester Gould, the creator of the comic strip Dick Tracy. Gould's father-in-law, George Gauger of Wilmette, built this stucco Spanish-style bungalow for the newly married couple in 1927. Gould set up his drawing table in a sunroom on the north side, off the dining room, and it was there, in 1931, that he created the character of police detective Dick Tracy. The family lived happily here for 8 years. Chet and Edna belonged to a bowling club that bowled at Blazers Bowling Academy on Ridge Road, and he even drew a cartoon about it. But Chet longed for the country life, and in 1936 the family moved to an abandoned farm in Woodstock. Our next stop is 1220 Maple Avenue, once the home of author and lawyer Scott Turow. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you outside Turow's home. Our third stop is 1220 Maple Avenue. Scott Turow moved his family into this house in 1984, when he was still working as an assistant prosecutor in Chicago. He worked on his first novel during his train commute into town, and completed it in the unfinished basement of this house. When the novel, Presumed Innocent, appeared in 1987, it was a huge worldwide success, spending 44 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. The Turows expanded this house dramatically over the years. In 2001, they left Wilmette, moving into a lakefront mansion in Glencoe. A 2017 interview with Turow asked about his use of recurring characters across novels. Here's Turow's response, which looks back at his Wilmette commuting days.
For many, many years, I rode the commuter train from, at that point, Wilmette, Illinois, downtown. And I'd see the same people get on the train. I'd have no clue who they were. And then a decade passes and somehow that person moves in next door or ends up as a client or becomes a friend through, hobbies like golf. It's bizarre. But all of a sudden people move from the complete background where they're no more than, familiar faces passing on the commute to people who have an involvement, sometimes an intimate involvement in your life. And that's exactly what happens in my novels. That's what happens in Kindle County, that characters who are in the background in one book all of a sudden become the center of attention in another one. And I just think that's very faithful to life.
We are now leaving the home of Scott Turow and heading over to 1050 Linden Avenue, once the home of film star Ralph Bellamy. It can be difficult to stop on this busy section of Linden, so just find a good place to pull over, park, then walk to this address. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you outside Bellamy's home. We are at the fourth stop on our tour, 1050 Linden Avenue. Ralph Bellamy, one of Hollywood's best-known screen stars in the 1930s and 1940s with movies like His Girl Friday, spent his childhood in this house. He and his parents moved here in 1909 when he was 5 years old, and he went on to attend Central School and later New Trier. In his autobiography, he wrote about how glad he was as a kid that his family's house was east of the tracks, even if it was just half a block. The dividing line between East Side kids and West Side kids was a big deal in those days. Toward the end of his life, in 1980, the folks who owned this house wrote Bellamy a letter, and he wrote back, with lots of his memories about growing up in Wilmette. Bellamy's letter was donated to the museum and is now included in our collections. Here is an excerpt describing the house when they first moved in over 100 years ago. Quote, "There was no electricity, and we used kerosene lamps. There was no plumbing. The only water came from a pump in the kitchen sink. The rooms were small. Our toilet was an outhouse, and the dirt-floored basement could only be reached by outside tilted cyclone doors." End quote. Bellamy goes on to describe the improvements his family made to the house, and that are sure to have been appreciated by the homeowners who followed, which included putting on an addition up front under the new low roof and adding modern conveniences. While the focus of this tour is on our local legends, it is fun to think about the history of their homes and how they might have changed. Our next stop is 915 Linden Avenue, once the home of sculptor Jean Miner Coburn. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you outside Coburn's home. This is the fifth stop on our tour, 915 Linden Avenue, once the home of sculptor Jean Miner Coburn. Born and raised in Madison, Wisconsin, Jean Miner came to Chicago to study painting at the School of the Art Institute. While there, she trained under famous sculptor Lorado Taft and discovered her passion for sculpture. One of her most celebrated sculptures, Forward, was commissioned for the Wisconsin Pavilion at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. The 7-foot-tall bronze figure was placed outside the Wisconsin State Capitol in 1895 and now resides indoors at the Wisconsin State Historical Society headquarters. A replica statue replaced the original that stood outside the Capitol. It was damaged during summer 2020 protests and has been temporarily removed for extensive repairs. Jean married Alonzo Coburn in 1896, and they moved to Wilmette in 1903, where she was active in the community. Coburn created bas-reliefs for the Women's Club of Wilmette building, and a 1937 bulletin of the Women's Club describes how member Jean Coburn could be found each morning in the studio at the rear of her home, quote, "capably and serenely translating some of the simple grandeur of her own soul to lifelike resemblance in her models," end quote. After the devastating 2015 fire at the Women's Club, Coburn's plaster reliefs were recast in bronze and are on display at both the old and new entrances of the reopened club. Coburn continued to sculpt into her 90s, at which time it became too difficult to continue, but she worked in pastels up to the week she died at age 101. Our next stop is 808 Greenleaf Avenue, once the home of TV and movie star Hugh O'Brien. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you outside O'Brien's home. We are at our sixth stop, 808 Greenleaf Avenue. Do you remember Hugh O'Brien, who played Wyatt Earp on TV from 1955 to 1961? He was in a lot of TV shows and movies in the 1960s, too, but he spent much of his childhood here in Wilmette, where he was known as Buddy Crampy. He attended Central School. Hugh graduated from New Trier in the class of 1943, later attending a military academy and entering the Marine Corps. He was discovered by Hollywood's only female director of the time, Ida Lupino. Hugh O'Brien died in September 2016 at the age of 91. Here is a brief clip of the Wyatt Earp TV show theme song.
Wyatt Earp, Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold. Long live his fame, and long live his glory, and long may his story be told.
Before we leave his house on Greenleaf, I want to point out that this street looked a bit different when O'Brien lived here. Notice how wide it is. A trolley ran here from 1899 to 1955. Officially called the Chicago and Milwaukee Electric Railway Company when established, it was more commonly known as the North Shore Line. It was an all-electric line that operated between the Loop and Milwaukee and offered both local service and limited service. The latter had more opulently furnished cars and included a parlor buffet car and an observation car. The North Shore Line was considered the best electric interurban in the U.S. during its heyday. We're ready to move on now to our next stop, 500 Fifth Street, once the home of artist Edward Gorey. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you outside the apartment building that was Gorey's home. We are at the 7th stop on our tour. For a short time, artist Edward, known as Ted Gorey, lived in one of the apartments at 500 Fifth Street. The Linden Crest Apartments were the first apartments built in Wilmette in the 1920s, and they were very controversial because many residents didn't want apartment buildings in the village. The Goreys moved here in 1936 when their son Ted was 12 years old, and they lived on the 3rd floor. Ted had a special friend his age named Betty Burns, who also liked to draw, and they rigged up a pulley system from his window to send notes back and forth between her family's apartment and his. Ted went to Stolp School, then the junior high for the East Side, and he was in charge of the artwork for the 1937 Stolp School yearbook. The 9 drawings he did for that yearbook are Edward Gorey's first published art. Gorey published many volumes of his vaguely creepy pen and ink drawings and narratives, but he may be most widely known for the animated drawings for the opening of Masterpiece Mystery on PBS. Our next stop is 325 Maple Avenue, once the home of movie star Charlton Heston. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you outside Heston's home. Our 8th stop, 325 Maple Avenue, is where movie star Charlton Heston grew up in the 1930s. Charlton attended 7th and 8th grade at Stolp School, next to Central School, where one of his classmates was Edward Gorey. His mother, Lila, had divorced and remarried, and during the summers, Charlton worked in the same Chicago steel mill as his stepfather, before he got the title role in his senior year, 1941, in a silent 16mm film adaptation of Peer Gynt, directed by David Bradley, then a Northwestern student. Bradley also cast Heston as Mark Antony in his later film Julius Caesar. Bradley went on to teach film studies at UCLA. Heston later wrote that theater proved to be his salvation. He won a scholarship to study theater at Northwestern. Heston starred in over 100 films during his career, and some of his most famous parts include Moses in The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur in the movie of the same name. Our next stop will be 17 Canterbury Court, once the home of Kraft Foods founder James Lewis Kraft. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you outside Kraft's home. We are at our 9th stop, 17 Canterbury Court. James Lewis Kraft, founder of Kraft Foods, once lived in this splendid Tudor revival home. Kraft founded Kraft Foods in Chicago in 1909 with his brothers, some of whom also lived in Wilmette. He was president of the company until his death in 1953. James Kraft was known for inventing processed cheese in 1916, along with iconic items like Miracle Whip, Kraft macaroni and cheese, and Parquet margarine. He was also an innovator in advertising his products. One of the first people to use color ads in national magazines, and one of the first to sponsor radio and television programs such as the Kraft Musical Review and the Kraft Television Theater. He and his wife and daughter moved into this house in 1935, designed by Abraham Epstein in 1930. It sits on 2 lots. Kraft's biggest enthusiasm, apart from his business, was jade, the semi-precious stone, and he had a workshop in the basement of this house where he cut and polished the stones. He even wrote a book about his hobby. Here are recollections of visits to Aunt Pauline's and Uncle Lou's, known by his business associates as JL, a house of wonders at Christmas. Quote, "The front hall of the house rose 2 stories, and within the curve of the stairway stood an enormous Christmas tree. The only tree that I had ever seen that was larger was in the walnut room at Marshall Field & Co. on State Street in Chicago. To the left, in the living room, Aunt Pauline would gather the children around the grand player piano and sing Babes in Toyland and other Christmas songs as we watched the paper rolls scroll by, revealing the words as the music played. We had a piano at home, but not a piano that played itself. Deeper into the house was a room, perhaps a solarium, but I only remember it at night, with a fountain in a tile basin. We were pretty free to explore the house while the adults conversed. My best discovery was the pink ceramic chair in the bathroom that was really a toilet. It was modeled in the style of Louis XIV, with armrests and cabriole legs and a caned back and seat cover. Before we move on, note the remains of a trail tree in the front yard and the plaque installed in 1949, when the Krafts still lived there. Our next and last stop is the site of wildlife rescuer Francis Poe's home in 147 and 155 Linden Avenue. Please pause your audio tour, and I will meet you on Linden, near the canal where Poe's house once stood. Our last stop is 147 and 155 Linden Avenue, the site of the home of wildlife rescuer Francis Poe. She began her career as an illustrator for encyclopedias, then moved on to sculpting porcelain animal figurines sold by a Chicago art gallery. Miss Poe managed to create delicate antlers and horns that didn't break in the kiln, lending her delicate touch to her sculpture in the same way she did to caring for animals. Francis Poe was a state-licensed wildlife rehabilitator who for almost 50 years cared for all sorts of sick and injured animals out of her home on these 2 lots, then returned them to the wild or nature preserves. Miss Poe was known to turn down any sort of payment or donation, providing for the animals herself. In a 1984 interview for an article in the Chicago Tribune, Poe estimated that she and her husband spent about $50,000 a year taking care of the wildlife guests at what was known as a Grand Hotel. They also spent 8 to 10 hours a day caring for the 1,500 or so animals in residence. It's fun to imagine, along the canal, this Grand Hotel, with its many cages providing temporary residence or a more permanent sanctuary for injured deer, raccoons, skunks, possums, fox, ducks, seagulls, and other animals brought here by local families and from as far away as Wisconsin and Indiana. This brings us to the end of our Wilmette Local Legends audio tour, Part 1. Thank you so much for joining the Wilmette Historical Museum to explore this little bit of local history. We hope that you'll join us for the second half of this audio tour when it is released later this summer. We also invite you to stop by and tour our museum at 609 Ridge Road.